know, the committee members take turns introducing speakers, and I selected Professor Goldman for several reasons. First, I like his name. My son is named Ari, as many of you know, and my maiden name is Goldman, although we are a part of the family not related to anyone, especially famous people like Ari. Second, I was impressed with Professor Goldman's work with students. He has taught at the Columbia Journalism School since 1993. He's director of the school's Scripps Howard program in religion, journalism, and the spiritual life. And that program has enabled him to take students in his Covering Religion seminars on funded study abroad tours during spring break. In the past, his class has visited India, Russia, Ukraine, Ireland, Italy, Israel, Jordan, and the West Bank. Perhaps he could take people like us on one. In addition to the religion seminar, Professor Goldman also teaches reporting, the Master's Project, and the course The Journalism of Death and Dying, which looks at everything from writing obituaries to covering natural disasters and suicide. Before coming to Columbia, he spent 20 years at the New York Times, most of it as a religion writer, and over the course of his career, he wrote over 1,000 articles. It boggles my imagination. 1,000 articles. He was educated at Yeshiva University, Harvard, and Columbia. He was a visiting Fulbright professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a Skirball Fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies in England, and a scholar in residence for a semester at Yeshiva Stern College for Women. Third, I admire Professor Goldman as a thinker. I first became aware of his work when I picked up his bestseller, The Search for God at Harvard, in the early 90s. At the time, I thought, what an interesting perspective he has, even as I was struggling with some of the content. Many years later, for a Melton course, I read A Year of Kaddish, and I thought, what an interesting perspective he has, and how perceptive he is. I know that today you will be getting the advantage of Professor Goldman's perspective and his perceptivity. So please join me in welcoming Ari Goldman.
Thank you, Sharon. Cousin Sharon. A very creative introduction. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here, and I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, but especially my student Jamie Bedrin, who is a graduate of Columbia Journalism School, teaches journalism, is a wonderful radio reporter, and was on one of those trips. She went to Israel with my class a few years ago, and it's nice to see her and other familiar faces in the room. Including my butcher. Who knew? Well, So we've been talking for a long time about coming to Temple Beth Rishon, and I've been in touch with the rabbi and with Sharon Glassman, and they said, you can't be too political. So I said, right, I gave them some ideas. I said, a little too political, I don't know, Trump, no, you can't, Clinton, no, too political. So I said, I got it. I'll talk about the New York Times. Everybody loves the New York Times. Everybody, it's not political at all. What can we do? I could not have predicted what happened these last few weeks, so it's not my fault that this veers into the political. And we'll have time in the Q&A to challenge some of my points of view and my perceptions. So I've had this is a very vibrant congregation. Nice to see all the children and see all the programs going on. But whenever I go to a shul, I like to go to the heart of the shul. I went to the sanctuary just to see where you pray. It reminded me of a story. So every Saturday, a rabbi, it's not a rabbi joke, a doctor. Every Saturday, a doctor and a lawyer sit together. Those are their regular spaces, the rabbi, the doctor, and the lawyer. I'm gonna get the joke right. The doctor and the lawyer sit together. And all through the service, people come up to the doctor. and they say, I've got a little rash. Would you mind looking at my rash? My back is killing me. My son fell. Can you see if he broke his leg? I have such a headache. Doctor, what should I do? The doctor comes to pray, comes to daven. But all through the service, people are asking him for medical advice. So he turns to his friend, the lawyer, and he says, what should I do? People are driving me crazy. I'm just coming here to pray. He says, I've got an idea for you. You're a professional. After Shabbos, send them a bill. Send them a bill. I guarantee nobody's going to come near you anymore. The doctor is so relieved. What a great idea. He goes home. A few days later, the mail comes, and in it there's a bill from the lawyer. For services rendered. I love that story because I feel like that doctor. I go to shul, and people say, you write for the New York Times? Why is the New York Times so tough on Israel? Why do they keep writing about Israel? Aren't there other countries to write about? Aren't there other problems in the world? When a Jew gets indicted, it's on page 1. When a Gentile gets indicted, I don't find it in the paper. When the IDF shoots, it's on page 1. When Arabs throw stones, they don't take pictures of that. And then there are questions that just start with a name. That Tom Friedman. That Roger Cohn. And those are just the Jewish writers. People hate the New York Times. And I go to shul and I hear about it. But it's more complicated than that. You see, people not only hate it, but they want to be part of it. They need it. I have a program for left-handed Jewish children. Can you write about me? My daughter's getting married. How do I get her wedding announcement in the New York Times? I wrote an op-ed. Used to be everybody was working on a novel. Now everybody's writing an op-ed. I wrote an op-ed. Can you help me get it published? This is a true story. One elderly gentleman even came up to me and said, can you write my obituary? Yes, write it and show it to me. Otherwise, I'll never see it. If only I could send them all a bill after Shabbat. I'd be a rich man. So given that I get all these questions, I thought I'd put together a talk called All the Religion That's Fit to Print. It might also be called The New York Times, the newspaper Jews love to hate. So let me test my theories about the New York Times with a few questions. How many of you grew up in a home that got the New York Times delivered? Wow. Okay, so there's almost half of you. What other papers did you get? I'm sure everybody grew up with a paper. Maybe New York Post, Star Ledger, Bergen Record, a lot of New Jersey people.
Wall Street Journal. Wall Street Journal.
Wall Street Journal. Hartford Courant? I'm a Hartford boy.
How about the Forward?
Herald Tribune.
The Forward.
You're dating yourself. The Herald Tribune was my favorite paper until 1967 when sadly it closed. Other newspapers you grew up with?
Newsday.
Yediot. Yediot Ahronot. Journal News. Yeah. Staten Island.
Boston Globe.
Boston Globe.
Patterson Evening News. Patterson.
Patterson. Evening News. Boy, there aren't too many evening papers left. Long Island Press. This is like writing an obituary. I mean, none of these papers are alive anymore. Yeah.
Cincinnati Enquirer.
Cincinnati Enquirer, still going?
The Forward. The Forward.
The Forward.
The Forward.
I grew up in a home that just had newspapers all over the place. My grandfather was retired when I was a kid, and if you asked me what did your grandpa do, I'd say he read newspapers. Because in the morning he'd get the Hartford Courant, and then he'd read that for a few hours, and then the mailman would come, and the mailman would bring the Allgemeiner Journal, and the Der Yid, and the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. And then in the afternoon, you got the Hartford Times. Right, the Hartford Times.
Papers in my house.
That's how he spent his day, but by the evening, he'd have dinner and watch Walter Cronkite. So that was, and I think that's what happens in Jewish homes. There's a lot of news, a lot of stimulation. But getting back to my questions about your newspaper habits, so about almost half of you grew up with the New York Times. How many of you still get it delivered? Oh my, okay, so even more. All right. This is not the failing New York Times, I have a feeling, right? that we're hearing so much about. And some of you, I heard someone say electronic. You get the electronic edition or the paper edition. And how many of you feel compelled to look at it and read it, but still hate it? Okay, all right. Fair enough, fair enough. As long as you're buying it, that's what's important. As long as you're supporting it. I do think, and this, Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, was on, after the New York Times was barred from a White House press briefing, Dean Baquet was on CNN, and he said that Trump is helping us. Every time he attacks the New York Times, every time he calls it fake news, subscriptions go up. We are, I mean, you know, the paper is still, I think all newspapers are in a perilous situation, but this kind of attack does not hurt the paper. It is not the failing New York Times. It's actually gaining strength through these attacks. The president has labeled the New York Times the enemy of the American people. And I think in some ways this just goes against our grain. It goes against our grain as Americans, and I'm going to talk about why it should go against our grain as Jews as well. This charge of fake news and the failing New York Times is just so disturbing because, and it's telling the newspaper of record that it can't be in a White House briefing is very disturbing. When I worked at the New York Times, and I worked there before coming to Columbia Journalism, saying you were from the New York Times opened doors. It guaranteed access. Now, now people are suspicious. Not in this room, but by and large, they're suspicious. The Times is not failing. Their digital subscriptions have shot up in recent weeks. They're hiring new reporters and editors. CNN just announced it's hiring 50 reporters. And while it's harder to get maybe into the White House briefing room, the importance of covering the agencies in Washington has never been more important because that's where the news is happening, and that's where the dissent can be heard. That's where you can get the best stories. So what may be bad for America, and I do believe that these attacks against the press are bad for America, but they're good for journalism, and I'll add, now that I teach at Columbia, they're good for journalism schools. Our applications are up 10% this year. And that's just, in reaction to the election. I suspect they'll be up even more next year. So the Times, as those of you who get it, those of you who follow it online, has a new ad campaign about the truth. I'm glad to know that it's taking root and people are paying attention. So, as I said, I worked at the Times, and I can tell you that the paper does not have an agenda. Of course, the editors and the reporters exercise news judgment. That's their job. They have to decide what's news and what's not news. But they don't favor one party over the other or one ideology over the other. I did not see a bias. I saw an openness, and newspaper loves to challenge things even that it likes. The only bias that I saw, and journalists love to say this, the only bias that journalists have is for a good story. We love a good story, whether it's about the Republicans or the Democrats. Who brought down Eliot Spitzer? A Democratic governor endorsed by the New York Times, elected in with an overwhelming mandate. The sheriff of Wall Street was going to be our governor. It was the New York Times who broke the prostitution story that led to Spitzer's downfall. Now that's the so-called Democratic newspaper going after the Democratic governor. The Times was tough. Some people say too tough on Hillary Clinton during the campaign. They made a lot of. They wrote a great deal about the WikiLeaks revelations and about the DNC emails. Its news pages were filled with unflattering stories, going over Benghazi one more time, going over the email story, going over the Clinton Foundation and her closeness to Wall Street. The Times was also tough on Donald Trump. I don't have to remind you of that, but there was definitely an effort to be even-handed in its investigations and in its holding the candidates to account. Ultimately, of course, to no one's surprised, the Times endorsed Clinton and included an extraordinary separate editorial warning against the dangers of Donald Trump. But that was on the editorial page. And people get the two confused. The editorials is a place for opinion, and the op-ed is for other opinions, and then there are the news pages. What's happened in journalism in recent years is that opinion has seeped more and more into the news pages, and I think we can see a lot of examples of that. And later in the Q&A, I can talk about why that's happened. But there's a place for news, and there's a place for opinion. I don't know how many of you follow the organization CAMERA, which is about an organization that defends Israel in the media and looks for indications of bias in the media against Israel. It's a very strident organization, but they too sometimes sort of get confused between what's news and what's opinion. So here's from the CAMERA website. No, New York Times, Abbas does not accept the Jewish state. So they're saying that the New York Times had this point of view, but if you look, it's a New York Times op-ed that may or may not misinterpret Abbas and his opinion. So I don't know that the New York Times says that, or whether a columnist or an opinion writer for the New York Times says that, but that distinction is important. The question is, do they have to fact check all their opinion writers? Some might say yes, but still, this does not mean the New York Times is anti-Israel. The New York Times is giving voice and letting a Palestinian representative speak. So I think sometimes the critics of the Times jump to conclusions. I'm not saying the Times always gets it right. One of my favorite definitions of journalism is it is the first draft of history. My late friend Dick Shepard, who was a New York Times reporter, used a food metaphor. He said that we are the short order cooks of history. We make the omelets and the burgers. We leave the souffles and the filet mignons to the chefs and the historians. And the first draft is often flawed. But what's great about journalism is that we can correct our mistakes. Corrections run every day in the newspaper and online. The biggest New York Times correction came in 1996, when in honor of the centennial of the paper under the ownership of the Sulzberger Oaks family, a Jewish family, as you know, it issued an apology and a correction for its failure to adequately cover the destruction of European Jewry during the Second World War. On the Times website, you can find an entire educational curriculum about its failure to cover the Shoah. So examples abound about how news of the destruction of European Jewry was really not highlighted, and how it could have made a huge difference if the New York Times had taken it more seriously. And the Times acknowledged that it didn't cover that story the right way. It didn't recognize the severity of what was going on and the urgency of it. And there have been dissertations and books and many things written about the Times' failure during this time. But what's important, the point that I want to make, is that they made a mistake, certainly too late. They corrected it, but built into the capacity, built into the newspaper's capacity, is that it can correct its mistakes. The Times has publicly regretted its coverage of the weapons of mass destruction, and how in some ways it was served as an agent of the Bush administration to rile up the war cry for the Gulf War. So journalism is certainly an imperfect tool, but it's the best that we have. And built into the tool are mechanisms to correct and modify what went wrong. So I could argue, and I'm sure there are lawyers in the room because my lawyer joke got a lot of laughs. I could argue from a constitutional perspective, our First Amendment guarantees, our bedrock of our democracy. I don't have to remind you of that. Freedom of the press and freedom of religion are both enshrined in the First Amendment. And it was a principle of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." So the importance of a free press is more important than having a government. And democracy rests on this principle. Of course, Jefferson was not naive. He saw dangers in newspapers as well. And while this journalism professors love to quote the line about the importance that a press serves to democracy, you don't see this quote quite as much. Jefferson said, "The man who reads nothing at all is better educated than the man who reads nothing but newspapers." So relying only on newspapers is not a good idea, but they are a necessary tool of our democracy. There's a mountain of case law that supports the constitutional right to a free press. It's no surprise that when Sean Spicer excluded the New York Times and other news organizations from a White House briefing, many called it un-American. It was un-American to single out a news organization and say, "You can't cover the White House because we don't like your coverage." But in my remaining time with you, what I'd like to do is show you that it's not only un-American, it's un-Jewish. So our most sacred text, Torah, is called Torat Emet, the Torah of truth. Our highest value as Jews is the truth. And as we see in the Torah, the truth sometimes hurts. When people complain to me about negative news, I say, look at the Torah. It's filled with negative stories. It's filled with rivalries and betrayals and deceptions. How does it start? Right? Adam and Eve sin. Then Cain kills Abel. Abraham banishes Hagar at Sarah's insistence. Jacob tricks Esau and his father Isaac. The brothers betray Joseph. The children of Israel worship a golden calf. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, sins. But the Torah doesn't pretty everything up. It doesn't engage in cover-ups of bad news. The Torah tells the story, warts and all. Just like my Rebbe would say, lahavdil, to separate from Torah and newspapers, but just like the newspapers tell the truth, the Torah tells the truth. It's the very opposite of fake news. And what's our other sacred text? And that's the Talmud. I don't know if there are any Talmud scholars here, but the one thing that everybody knows about the Talmud is that there's never one opinion, right? There's Rav and Shmuel, there's Rava and Abaye, there's Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, and what are they doing? They're arguing. This one says left, this one says right, this one says kosher, this one says non-kosher, this one says 8 candles, this one says 1 candle. And the beauty of the Talmud and why the Talmud is 63 volumes and why you never finish it and you could never know it all is because it has so many opinions, because they record all of the points of view of the various rabbis. And for me, that's what you find in a good newspaper. The Republicans say this, the Democrats say this, the cops say this, the robbers say this, the Mets say this, the Yankees say that. It's like, for me, reading a newspaper is like reading a page of the Talmud. And there's a great statement in the Talmud. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. This is very small, so I'll have to read it. For 3 years, there was dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The former asserting, the law is in agreement with our view. The latter contending, no, the law is in agreement with our view. So you have Shammai and Hillel, the 2 great schools arguing, no, the laws aren't our side. No, the law's on our side. And they're fighting in the house of study. But then, a bat kol, a heavenly voice announced, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. What this one says and what that one says, they are both the word of the living God. So, yes, he's right and he's right, but how can they both be right? Right? Remember from Fiddler on the Roof. You're right too. But the law is in agreement with the ruling of Beit Hillel. He's right, but the truth is on this side. Still, even though it's a minority opinion, even though we don't follow that opinion, it's still worth hearing, and it's still worth giving it a forum, and it's still important to hear both sides. And that for me, as a student of the Talmud, becoming a newspaper reporter was an easy transition, because I don't have to know who's right and who's wrong. I just have to know that your voice is worth being heard and your voice is worth being heard. We entertain different points of view, but ultimately we strive for the truth. In this difficult time, this is our task as Jews and as Americans. So I am very proud of the press these days. I'm proud of Jake Turks, who I had the pleasure of meeting. And I actually just wrote a column in support of him in an ultra-Orthodox magazine called Ami Magazine. The article is called A Tale of Two Jakes. And it's about Jake Turks, who, do you all recognize Jake Turks? He's the one who challenged President Trump with a question about anti-Semitism and was told, sit down, you're a liar. I read about my Tale of Two Jakes, about Jake Turks and Jake Tapper. And well, you're from New Jersey, you must know Jake Tapper is a yeshiva boy. No, he went to yeshiva. He went to Solomon Schechter, then he went to Akiba in Philadelphia. And he went to Dartmouth. But that's the Tale of Two Jakes. But I'm proud of Jake Turks for challenging the president. I'm proud of April Ryan for urging the president, telling the president that he has to meet with the Black Caucus. And when he turns on her and he says, "Can you arrange that? Can you make an appointment?" So The two great lines about that was, no, all black people don't know each other. And the other great line was that the women do other things and become your secretary. Right? It's like, make an appointment for me, right? And how about the story today about Obama tapping the phones and I forget what he calls President Obama, but it's nothing very flattering. Is he sick or is he bad? Bad, yeah.
All for investigation of the tweets.
So this I'm not proud of, but I am proud that the New York Times could say what Trump did, but offering no proof. And the New York Times has picked up a lot of opposition for saying the president's a liar, but the president is not telling the truth. He is a liar, and calling that out is not partisan. It's truth-telling. It's truth-telling, and it's seeking the truth. I mean, if he has evidence, let's see it. I'm proud of the New York Times for showing, its backbone and not backing off. I'm proud of the Washington Post for some remarkable reporting that they've done. The great rivalry, some of you may remember Watergate, but the great rivalry between the New York Times and the Washington Post is back. They're both on this story. For several years, the Washington Post pulled back and decided it was not going to be a national newspaper. It was going to focus more on Washington. But in recent months, and I think also under the leadership of Jeff Bezos from Amazon, it's decided to become an international newspaper again, and it's beating the pants off the New York Times, which is good for journalism and good for the New York Times because it gets the adrenaline going. And they're all trying desperately to get to the truth about the Trump campaign ties to Russia. If reporters didn't probe, if anonymous sources didn't talk, Michael Flynn would still be the National Security Advisor. And Attorney General Jeff Sessions would still be in charge